Blog Talk Radio.
Namaste, everybody. Welcome to Nature of Reality Radio. It is March 12th, 2014. I am your host, Andrew Fisher, broadcasting every Wednesday from the suburbs of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern. Tonight we're going to have Leslie Manookian on exposing the disturbing nature of reality in regards to the world of vaccines and specifically how they're toxic, who's behind the conspiracy, who the conspiracy is designed to hurt. We're also going to discuss other health issues such as raw milk, because Leslie's done some work in regards to that. And we're also going to discuss coal, because Leslie did some work in regards to a coal plant. We're going to discuss whether or not coal is as harmful as environmentalists say it is, and also what problems coal burning can cause with health. Well, as far as I'm concerned, we shouldn't have coal or oil because the government is hiding so much suppressed technology from us. Leslie hasn't called in yet. She hopefully will call in. I did tell her I will cover news first. So that being said, let's get the news courtesy of Infowars.com. By the way, if you want to get any more information in regards to Leslie Manookian's work, you can visit her website, The Greater Good. I think it's thegreatergood.com. That's the name of the documentary that she's known as being the producer for. A great documentary, recommended to anybody. And she's done interviews on Infowars if anyone wants to check that out. But anyway, in regards to the headlines here, Mr. Yatsenyuk goes to Washington. Yats is a well-connected globalist operative. Man, these names are so hard to pronounce. You don't even remember when you hear them who the name belongs to. I believe this is the new guy who's in charge of Ukraine right now. I'm not positive about that. I don't have time to look into this, but it says he's a well-connected globalist operative. So this is another example of the New World Order putting one of their own puppets into power when another government tumbled, just like Hosni Mubarak in Egypt was replaced by the Muslim Brotherhood, Morsi, an operative, and the real forces that were controlling Egypt before that are the same that are controlling after. We don't want the same to be the case with the Ukraine, but it looks like that's what's going to happen. Let's see. Next article. Denver cops forced to wear cameras, unable to delete footage. Well, that's good. It's nice to know some cops are understanding that they are supposed to have recording equipment on them, and they have a right to be filmed in public. Yeah, we have a right to film the cops in public. There is no reasonable expectation of privacy in public, therefore the police can film us, and therefore we can film the police. That is your right. Let me make that clear. Next article. Americans worried about the economy, not climate change. Well, rightfully so, because there is no global warming. It's all a hoax. Al Gore is a fraud, just like Bill Gates is a fraud, which we'll be getting into on the show today. Understandable reasons. But anyway, it's good to know people are worrying the economy might collapse. There is a video that was recently released by Porter Stansberry, research and investments firm, which is headquartered in Baltimore. A very accurate track record of making stock predictions and trends, and talked about how on July 1st there's a bill that's going to be passed in regards to countries using the dollar as a reserve currency have to report to the IRS, and for reasons he explains in the video, this could signal the end of the dollar July 1st, 2014. Big major point there. Another video by another guy at the Stansberry research firm came out talking about how China is hoarding so much gold right now that they're hinting that they want the yuan, the Chinese currency, the yuan, to be the global reserve currency, and they're going to have a lot of gold to back it with when the dollar collapses. And, well, all the more reason to buy as much gold and silver as you can afford. Next article. NSA pretends to be Facebook to spy on the world. Malware can record audio and take photos of web users without their knowledge. Well, told you the NSA was spying on everybody. They even have a base on the moon. That completely falls out of the realm of what we're going to talk about here, but they are the real shadow government because they are snooping on everybody. And let's see here. A live feed, our march at South by Southwest. That was a Second Amendment gun rally in Texas, I believe, and Infowars reporters were there. It's nice to know people understand that if we lose the Second Amendment, we lose everything. Next article. Obama and Biden to meet central banker aligned with Ukraine fascists. Well, here it says here, that Yatsenyuk guy, he was handpicked by the U.S. State Department and the Color Revolution's non-government organizations. So I always want the U.S. to stay out of foreign affairs because we are the Roman Empire of the modern era. invading other countries more than any other country in the world. Top 5 countries that invade other nations, I believe it's Russia at number 5, France number 4, Israel number 3, Great Britain number 2, and America number 1. And many people think they're living in the land of the free, so we don't realize that. So they think if we do anything in Ukraine, it's for freedom. Well, it's not. Obama and Biden, major globalist puppets. Let's see here. Next article. College group bans white people from diversity happy hour. That space is not for white people. Okay, diversity happy hour, you ban white people. I don't think you can get much more ironic than that. It's all another plot to divide and conquer through race war. Last article. Let me see if Leslie's not on yet. Before I get into this last article, let me just contact Leslie on Skype here. I don't know. Why don't you call in now? I'll get you on in a moment. All right, final headline, hopefully. High school students suspended for NRA T-shirts. Students suspended despite no rules against firearms shirts. Well, they say kids have no rights when they're in school. Well, as I discussed with my interview with Eddie Craig when I had him on my show, he talked about how in reality a public school does not have authority to violate the rights of students unless the parents give the school the authority to violate the rights of students. And the only reason parents can violate the rights of students legally is because the totality of the circumstances requires that for the development of a child, they need some guardian watching over them. And that means it is, in this case, a parent, and that means it is okay for them to violate the rights the parents are in some situations, unless they tend to cause harm to the kid. But schools, you need parental permission, unless, of course, it's freedom of speech in the classroom where you got to suppress what students say to teach them. But still, a shirt should not do that. Leslie's calling me. Let me let her know how to do this. I told her, use Skype to call that number. She'll be on momentarily, but while I'm waiting for her to do that, I want to let you know this whole thing about vaccines and flu shots being harmful. I'm kind of close to that in my family because my mother is an ophthalmologist, and I'll talk about this with Leslie, but she makes well over $100,000 a year, and because she's so respected, but yet she gives her employees flu shots. And I totally talk about my mother like this, but maybe it's a good thing I am, because she's giving out flu shots to help people, thinking that it'll help them health-wise, like maybe once, twice a year. And I'm telling her it's not a good idea to do that, but for some reason she seems to think the benefits outweigh the risks. So definitely want to talk with Leslie about that. See what she knows about flu shots, not just because I don't think flu shots and vaccines are the same thing, even though they both come from needles. Oh, another response from Leslie. Oh, says not so sure know how to do that, so let me let her know. Can you use a landline phone? Guess she's a newbie to Skype in terms of dialing, or maybe people always dial her, so she doesn't really need to call anybody. Maybe I may have to direct her to show her how to use Skype to call into this show. It's not even 10 after the hour yet, so we're not behind. Hopefully I'll get her on in the minutes as I take... maybe that's her. Leslie, is that you? Can you hear me?
Yes, it is. Hi, Andrew.
Hi. So you're new to calling numbers on Skype, huh?
Well, I can call your Skype name, but I don't have credit and money and stuff on it. So, no, I've never done it just to call a phone number.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I understand it does cost. So somebody's landline phone is better, but I always have to use Skype because Direct Connect is a freaking joke on my computer. But then again, Blog Talk Radio has all kinds of problems. But it's great to be talking to you. And we're going to not just talk about vaccines and flu shots, but also, like I said, raw milk and other foods, because I saw you were an activist on that on your profile on the Greater Good website. And also about the coal plant thing. But as I was saying before you called in, I know someone in my family, my mother, who's a well-known and respected ophthalmologist who makes over $100,000 a year, helping out a lot of people. I mean, she is an MD, and we all know MDs only treat the symptoms and not the causes, but that's out of the realm of this. The point is, she sometimes gives flu shots twice a year to her employees, and I don't exactly know where the flu shots are coming from. Maybe you might help me with that. But, I mean, these are different from vaccines. I think they're flu shots. And could you, if you were in my position and my mother was giving flu shots to her employees twice a year, and some of the employees I've spoken to said they got sick after the flu shot, after they gave it to her, and I was thinking, I told you so, but I don't want this happening again. But my mother
it is a vaccine. The flu shot is a vaccine.
Yeah.
And how she's giving them to him twice a year, I have no clue unless she's giving him the same shot, because they only come out with one every year.
It's
a huge can of worms that we can talk about.
Yeah, by all means, let's get into that, because I've tried to tell her about this, and she seems to think the benefits outweigh the risks, and she's flat out wrong.
Absolutely not.
So please, if you were in my position, what would you be telling my mother?
Do you want me to talk about it right now?
Yeah, by all means. Yeah, well, we'll talk about more of this in detail, but this, just for my sake, I had to get this off my chest.
Okay. I just didn't know if we were live and on, or if you and I are having this private conversation. So.
We are live. We are live. So.
Okay.
This is
so basically, the situation with flu vaccines or flu shots, people call them flu shots, but they are indeed flu vaccines. The health authorities and pharmaceutical companies every year decide what's going to be in the shot, and they choose a couple of strains. They usually do 3 strains, although there's now a quadrivalent strain or a 4-strain vaccine that's available. And they choose whatever they think is going to be most prevalent that year circulating in the environment. And they're oftentimes completely wrong. So, they choose a few strains of virus, they put those in the vaccine, and then if you're lucky enough to have come into contact with one of those 3 or 4 strains nowadays, then you might be protected. The science shows that you have to treat 100 people in order to prevent one person from having the flu. It's absurd. I mean, that's called a number needed to treat. And there's ample research that's been conducted by the Cochrane collaboration and Peter Dosch, who's at Johns Hopkins. Several organizations have looked into the literature around flu vaccines and found that essentially they don't work in 99% of the people. So let's put this in context. First of all, what we call the flu every year, only somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 to 15% of it's even flu. The vast majority of it, well over 80%, is not flu. It's a nonspecific respiratory disease. And no flu vaccine could possibly have any effect against that because it's not flu. So that's number one. Secondly, in the, as I mentioned, when you give the flu vaccine to people, you need to give it to literally 100 people in order to prevent one of them from getting flu-like symptoms, is what they call it. So that seems a little crazy to me, that you would want to treat 100 people with something that can kill them, because it can, and with the hope of preventing one of them from getting ill. We're talking about the flu, remember, not some, horrific disease. This is just the flu. And up until recent years, most people considered the flu a nuisance. Yes, a pain in the butt, but not something that we should all be terrified about. Half of all flu shots in America still contain mercury. Some of them contain 50,000 micrograms. Now, EPA says that 200 micrograms, 200 parts per billion, is what qualifies as hazardous toxic liquid waste. 50,000 micrograms is, I need to remember this, I think it's 1,000 times what EPA says is safe, but I'm not 100% sure on that, so don't hold me to it because I need to look it up. But it's a ridiculous, staggering amount. And even the vaccines that they say only contain a trace amount, so in some vaccines, thimerosal or mercury is used in the manufacturing process, and it cannot all be filtered out. even in those that have only 1 part per billion, or what less than 1 microgram, those things are still 10 times what EPA says is safe for drinking water, and this is being injected into us. So I have it. 50,000 parts per billion is the concentration of mercury in a multi-dose flu shot. And that 50,000 parts per billion is, now where is it on my piece of paper? I can't see where it is. I have the wrong page here. Yeah. Well, 200 parts per billion is what EPA says is safe, and this is 50,000 parts per billion. So you do the math. It's crazy. And if you look at the what EPA says is the limit for safe drinking water, it's 2 parts per billion. So these vaccines are 50,000 parts per billion. Some of them, that's a multi-dose. And in the ones that they say are acceptable that have a trace, it's 2 micrograms, and it's 2,000 parts per billion is what it is. So it's 10 times what EPA says is hazardous waste, and that's being injected, and that's called a trace. So you can just understand that this is crazy. If we then go and drill down a little bit further, and we go to the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System, which is a program that is run under the Department of Health and Human Services, and it's jointly operated by CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. So these two bodies operate this program, and the program's goal is to monitor adverse events to vaccinations. It's the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System. Now, the system is passive, meaning that no one is actively going out and looking for adverse events. The only way that adverse events get reported into the system is if somebody actively goes and does it. So a parent has to know that the system exists, and unfortunately, even though vaccine providers are required by federal law to inform patients that the system exists, very few people and patients who receive vaccines have any idea it exists. Secondly, vaccine providers are required by that same law to actually report vaccine adverse events, but it's really, really difficult to do it. It can take a couple of hours to make a report, and so it doesn't often happen. And the other thing is that vaccine providers have a vested interest in vaccines being perceived as safe, and so they don't report them. They don't want to report them. I mean, a pediatrician, something like 60 or 70% of their business is from well baby visits. Well baby visits are euphemism for vaccine visits. That's what it's for. It's to look at your baby and administer shots. And, if this is their bread and butter, are they going to be very inclined? I mean, they're just human beings after all. Are they going to be very inclined to go and really look into what the dangers are, or to report them when they see them, even when it's staring them in the face? So you can see that this is really, really problematic. So basically, if you look at the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System, in the last 6 months, so in this season's flu shots, just from the H1N1, there were 14,500 adverse events reported to VAERS in the United States. I mean, it's a staggering number, isn't that? 14,500 adverse events reported, and these are, most people don't even know it exists. So we're talking, this isn't like there are 14 people. We're talking 14,500 people in the United States reporting some kind of adverse reaction to the flu vaccine. And that's just immediate. What people don't understand is that the impact from vaccines is not fully understood in terms of its medium and long term. So there's recent research done in the last decade investigating what happens when we inject vaccines, and we are now finding that the heavy metals in vaccines, aluminum in particular, can take more than 10 years to migrate from the injection site throughout the body, through the lymphatic system to other parts of the body, and cross the blood-brain barrier into the brain or lodge itself in our organs. So looking at only 6 months doesn't tell us the whole picture. So I don't know if that's enough information to share with your mother, but flu vaccines are not without risk. That is the bottom line, and they are not at all what they're made out to be in terms of efficacy.
Thank you for covering that. I will try to convince my mother to listen to this specific segment. Hopefully she will listen. But
at least
anyway,
it was the beginning of the show, so you should be able to get her to listen to that part, right?
Right. By the way, if anybody wants to call in, the call-in number is 646-478-4747. Got a question for Leslie on anything involving environmentalist health, food health, and vaccine health, but specifically vaccine will be most of the show's conversation for today. Please, by all means, call in. And I'd like to start with keep this show started off with a bang.
Wait, Andrew, before we go there, can I just ask you a question?
Yeah.
Why is she giving them the flu vaccine? Twice a year. Why twice a year?
I was mistaken about that. For some reason, time is flying so fast nowadays for people like me who are very spiritually active, and that's why maybe I thought for me like half a year feels like a full year. So she only gives it like once a year. That's I was mistaken about that. But moving on. Bill Gates is a monstrous fraud. Have you researched him? And if you have, please get into the details about he's a vaccine-loving eugenicist fraud.
Boy, that's a big rabbit hole to go down.
Please do.
My biggest gripe with Bill Gates is that either he knows that vaccines are causing harm and he's doing nothing about it, or else he is ignorant about it and is still using his billions to push them without being educated. And vaccines are a medical product. After all, they're a pharmaceutical product, and all pharmaceutical products carry risks, known risks. In fact, the federal government, the Supreme Court, recognized that vaccines are unavoidably unsafe. That's federal law, recognizes this, and the Supreme Court. They're unavoidably unsafe. And if that's the case, how can anybody not inform themselves, number one, about what the issues and problems are with them, and number two, how can anybody with even half a conscience go and push them on the rest of the world? How can you not take your billions and spend them in terms of trying to make vaccines safer and then go and do it if you really want to? So I have a friend who went to a fundraiser, a big luncheon fundraiser. She's a fairly well-to-do woman in California, in the Silicon Valley, and she was at a fundraiser, and she was seated at a table with Bill Gates. And I'm sorry, I misspoke. It was her dear friend who was at the table with Bill Gates. It was her friend who was at the thing. So I've heard it from a good friend of mine. And what happened was, Bill Gates sits down, and this woman asks him, what are you up to? And he says, well, I'm launching a new vaccine, the MMR vaccine, in a new country in Africa, and I'm really, really proud of that. And he started talking about, how excited he was that they were launching the MMR, the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, in this new country in Africa. And she said, wow, that's fantastic. Well, if you're launching this new vaccine in Africa, or launching the MMR in a new country in Africa, that's a great opportunity for you to track what the autism rate is and see what it was before and after introduction of the MMR and see if there's any connection. Now, that seems like a perfectly reasonable suggestion, don't you think? Makes sense to me. It doesn't seem like it's very, outrageous. But Gates pushed his chair back from the table, stood up, and walked away and never returned. That was it. Those aren't the actions of somebody, I think, who really wants to know the truth, and I find that very disheartening. I also find it very disheartening that he talks about how he's doing God's work in India and places like that, where they're giving the oral polio vaccine to millions of kids, and the oral polio vaccine has not been used in this country for decades because it's known to have been the only cause of polio in the United States for decades. Oral polio vaccine is known to cause polio, and when it does, it oftentimes is worse than wild polio. So if you look at India in the last several years, I believe it was in 2011, there were over 40,000 cases of something called non-polio acute flaccid paralysis. And I believe in 2012 it was over 60,000 cases of that. These are kids who've gotten the oral polio vaccine, and the death rate is twice that what it is in kids who are not vaccinated with this vaccine. Huge complications, and at the same time as this is being administered to these kids, the World Health Organization and Gates are running around proclaiming that India is polio-free. When this, there's 60,000 cases of this disease, this illness that, looks exactly like polio and follows the polio vaccine, but they're not calling it polio, and it's twice as deadly as regular polio. and yet, he's trumpeting from every mountaintop, from any media outlet that will, listen, that they've eradicated polio from India. So, I mean, is he a, fraudulent eugenicist? Possibly. I don't know that. I can't prove it. But I certainly know for a fact that he is causing unbelievable damage to tens of thousands of children in India, and he either doesn't know or he's covering it up, and he's proclaiming that he's doing God's work at the same time. So I think that's incredibly, unethical. I mean, it's horrific. It's evil of the highest order, isn't it?
Yes,
I don't
it
know
is.
if you want to go further into it, but I just feel like everything I know about the man is that he's. But I wouldn't blame it only on Gates. This is one thing, Andrew. I mean, if you think about it, so I came from Wall Street. I worked for Goldman Sachs. I was on the inside of that game. And what happens is people who are in positions of power surround themselves with people who've come from the same fraternity as them, from the same universities, the same business schools, who are leaders, in quotes, in their field. The doctors, the lawyers, the business people, the pharmaceutical execs, all those. So who has Gates surrounded himself with? If you look at his, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, they are surrounded with people who are ex-CDC, who are pharmaceutical executives. The CEO of, I can't remember if it's Merck or GlaxoSmithKline, one of the biggest vaccine manufacturers in the world, sits on his board. These people are all tied in together. And so Gates isn't getting information from people who don't have a vested interest. He's getting information from people like Walter Orenstein, who's a nice man. I met him and interviewed him, but he ran the CD's vaccination program for 15 years. He has a vested interest in defending it because it would, he'd have egg on his face, to say the least, if it were to come out that vaccines don't work, that they cause harm, that they're responsible for the epidemic of chronic illness in American school children today, if they're responsible for the epidemic of autism in America today and globally. This would look really bad. But so I think these people, they surround themselves with people who are like themselves and who have a vested financial, ideological, or reputational interest in vaccines. And of course they're not going to get the whole scoop on it. So, he may be as evil as you make out, and he may just be the typical businessman who's surrounded himself with these people and therefore doesn't know the truth. I don't know, and I'm not willing to speculate on that. I just think it's shameful and disgraceful how he behaves and not educating himself about it.
Damn right. And one thing you didn't mention about how Planned Parenthood is actually in connection with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And you can say what you want about how women should have the right to get an abortion, but the fact is that organization really, even though some of the people care about what they do, they are designed as a eugenicist front group. And Bill Gates does have connections to that, so that's worth pointing out. And another thing worth pointing out on the subject of celebrities who want to depopulate the world. I've heard people say the big three of celebrities that really support eugenics are Bill Gates, Oprah Winfrey, and Ted Turner. I want to get into a little cool story about Ted Turner. I used to watch Captain Planet when I was a kid. The brainwashing obviously didn't work on me because now I realize a lot of the stuff that cartoon wanted to teach about global warming and the world being in peril is a lie. But at the end of the shows, they did things called Planeteer Alerts, and one of the Planeteer Alerts said the world at that time had 5 billion people, and they said, but even though the population's getting bigger, the world is not getting any bigger. And then they suggested, so when it's your turn to have a family, keep it a small family, because the more people there are, the more trouble the earth will be in. That was in-your-face children's brainwashing that supports the idea that Ted Turner is also a eugenicist. And on the subject of that, can you offer any comment on Oprah Winfrey and Ted Turner being involved in eugenics?
I got to tell you, Andrew, that's news to me. I have not heard anything about that. The only thing I would say is that if you look at the major media outlets, like Ted Turner's broadcasting, CNN, that he started, and the Oprah Winfrey Network, they are terrified of telling the truth, and they go after anybody who does try and tell the truth about vaccines or the harm they cause. And that they may be, there are many people who are now saying that vaccines are actually rendering us infertile or reducing our fertility. which is, clearly in line with some of the arguments that you were just making. What I will share is that we did try and get The Greater Good, my movie, that explores the intersection of vaccines and our personal rights and vaccine dangers. We tried to get it on the Oprah Winfrey Network, and they took a really hard look at it, and ultimately what we were told was that it was too controversial for them. So they refused to air it. Not because there was anything wrong with it, but because it was too dangerous for them to touch. And, I had a very interesting situation happen with CNN where our team was called by CNN and asked to fly to CNN, to New York City on the drop of the hat and appear and talk about vaccines and about the film. And I jumped on a plane and flew to New York City early the next morning. Got there. While I was on the plane, some story broke about a ambassador from Saudi Arabia, or I think it was a Saudi ambassador, was plotting supposedly the assassination of some U.S. official. Well, what happened was the CNN show was that news show was all about that issue that night, and so they couldn't have me on the show live. But after the show, they taped the segment with me, 4 minutes. And the host of the show, was super, super concerned, super earnest, very, very worried. A young woman who was just about to get married and contemplating having kids. And she was very, very concerned about this issue. And so she was really open to it. And we talked, we did the segment, and then afterwards we talked for 15 minutes. And she's just like, oh my gosh, this is really, really scary, And I gave her all the information, all the data, and she's like, it'll be on tomorrow night. That's what she told me. Well, I flew home to Idaho the next day, and no news ever came out really afterwards about this supposed assassination plot. I mean, there was it just died. It never happened anymore. You never heard anything about it, which is very strange. And then we were told every day. So I flew home and was expecting to, see myself on CNN that day. CNN didn't run it that night. They didn't run it the next night. They didn't run it the next night. Every day they said it's going to be on the next day. It's going to be on the next day. We promise. It's going to be on. Well, Friday night comes and it doesn't go. Doesn't screen. Doesn't air. And we called the producer of the show, and she said that we called the host of the show, and the host told one of our team that she pulled it because legal department pulled it. That the legal department at CNN said that they couldn't air it. And then we talked to the producer, and the producer said, no, that's not what happened. The host of the show and the host executive producer pulled it. Well, reading between the lines, whether it was legal, I strongly doubt that it was legal. It was most likely a business reason that, she got a lot of pressure and she was going to get harassed if she did show this. And so she was reined in. So this is the kind of stuff that CNN, that was founded by Ted Turner, participates in. And Oprah Winfrey's chickened to talk about this as well, even though, the minority population is being harmed the most. I mean, if you look at it, the HPV vaccines are now known to not even work in African American women because they carry different strains of HPV than white women do. And yet it's being pushed on them and given to them, freely. And there have been over 100 deaths from that vaccine. It's very, very interesting stuff. So I don't know. I can't comment directly on the eugenicist stuff. I can comment on the Planned Parenthood stuff. I know about that.
Yeah, go into that if you want.
Well, I'm 50 years old. I just turned 50 in January. And I always grew up believing that, Planned Parenthood was there to provide not just abortions, but contraception and help and advice to, young women who needed it, who were maybe couldn't afford it or in a tough situation and things like that, or who wanted to make sure that they didn't get pregnant. So I always thought it was just a purely well-intentioned organization. And it was a few years ago that somebody said, have you ever looked at some of the things that Margaret Sanger, who founded Planned Parenthood, had to say? And have you ever investigated the roots of it? And you are dead right, Andrew. It was about eugenesis. That's exactly what it was about. I mean, she actually said that creating large families was wicked, and she argued that we should apply a stern, I'm in front of my computer, a stern and rigid policy of sterilization and segregation to that grade of population whose progeny is tainted or whose inheritance is such that objectionable traits may be transmitted to offspring. She was a racist. She was very clearly and very openly about controlling minorities in America. And I think most people would be very, very surprised to know that that was the, origin of Planned Parenthood. Whatever its goal and mission may be today, that's definitely how it started, and it's pretty scary and sickening, isn't it?
Yes, it is sickening. By the way, I'm going to be on mute every single time you talk, so don't be shocked if there's a little pause when you finish talking. So, don't
no
want my
worries.
breathing to be... Yeah, okay. But you mentioned the EPA. It's interesting you mentioned that because I was a Township Commissioners meeting I was at yesterday. They were talking about cooperating with EPA regulations, and being the diehard patriot I am, I decided to speak out when they said questions from the public, and I said, can we please act like we understand that we do have the authority to nullify any federal government law or regulation that they try to impose on the people of the state and local governments by virtue of the 10th Amendment and the fact that the states created the federal government. And they said, yes, we will take that into account. So we are not obliged to obey EPA regulations. But with that being said, do you or do you not trust the EPA, or will your answer vary?
I don't trust the EPA at all.
Get into why.
I don't trust... Well, because EPA regularly sets standards that are suitable for polluters, but not necessarily for our health. I mean, it is well known. So one of the things that you talked about was that I had helped to defend a coal-fired power plant. You mentioned that on your website, and that's something that I've done in my advocacy group, and this is a perfect example. I have no problem with coal-fired power plants. I have a problem with coal emitting mercury, and mercury causing huge health problems to the unwitting public. And I have no problem with energy companies producing energy for all of us so that we can drive our cars and heat our homes and light our homes. But what I have a problem with is that poisoning us. And what EPA has done regularly is to tailor their recommendations to industry rather than to the health of the people. And I don't have, like I said, I don't have a problem if, we all need to be able to heat our homes and light our homes. I get that. We need energy. But we should do it in the safest way possible, and we should do it in the cleanest way possible. And we could very easily require that coal-fired power plants have no emissions for mercury, but that's not the case. And we could do the same thing for gold plants, gold smelters, and cement smelters. In fact, gold refineries and cement producers are the biggest producers of mercury. And where I live in the state of Idaho, we don't have a single coal-fired power plant, but almost all of our waterways are tainted with mercury, and we have fish advisories. You are advised not to eat the fish anywhere. This is one of the most rural states in the United States, and it has more wilderness area than any state in the lower 48, and yet we can't eat the fish out of our waterways. That's pretty scary. And why is that? Well, it's because what ends up happening is that, EPA and the government basically back the giant multinational corporations, not the states, not the individual peoples, and they don't protect our interests. I guess I don't know how you feel about it, Andrew, but I don't put a lot of faith in the federal government or any of its agencies to protect us. I think that they protect, for the most part, big businesses, giant businesses, and I don't really believe that we have a very capitalist system in the United States anymore. I think that may have been the case, I don't know, in previous decades or centuries, but now it seems like it's much more of a corporatocracy. And the government, by and large, is protecting the giant corporations, not you and me. And I don't think EPA is any different in that respect. FDA is constantly approving drugs that are known to kill and harm tens of thousands of Americans. I mean, there was a study done about 15 years ago that investigated FDA-approved, properly prescribed drugs and found that over 100,000 Americans die every year from properly used FDA-approved drugs. And, I just think this is what federal agencies do. And then what happens is the corporations can hide behind the fact that, well, EPA says it's okay or FDA says it's okay, and then they're not held accountable. So I think those federal agencies actually do a lot of harm in many, many ways.
Yes, they do, and of course they're compartmentalized. Only the people at the top of the ladder of authority, for the most part, have malevolent intentions. The rest are just doing their job. If they try to blow the whistle, they get hammered hard for it. But moving on.
Absolutely, Andrew. And the other thing is, who controls these agencies? It's not the average person who is trying to do a good job. It's somebody who's politically appointed. I mean, that's why, if you look at the Obama administration, I mean, Obama has appointed more Monsanto executives to senior posts at USDA and elsewhere in the United States government than any other president. And what's happened is that all the GMO products that Monsanto, GMO seeds and products that they're developing have been railroaded through despite widespread public opposition. This is because our federal agencies have been hijacked by these corporate interests. And I guess, I kind of subscribe to the point of view that if you give somebody power, they'll use it. And so I'd rather not give them any power. So I kind of think in some ways, our system of government has really diverged very far from what our founding fathers envisioned. And we have a situation now where we have people who are in government for their entire career, and they become very wealthy as a result of it, and they appoint their buddies, their corporate buddies, who donate to their campaigns, and those people are the ones who end up running EPA and FDA and CDC. A great example, if you'll indulge me just another second, is the head of the CDC. The head of the CDC was a woman named Dr. Julie Gerberding. She was head of CDC for 7 or 8 years, and when Obama was elected, she left office because he put in somebody new. He appointed somebody new. And she did her little cooling off period, and then guess where she went? She went to head up Merck Vaccines globally, one of the biggest vaccine producers in the world. So she makes policy for the United States, and be very clear that the CDC has influence all around the world. She makes policy for the United States about vaccines, and the CDC is responsible for taking FDA's approval of vaccines and then developing a recommended list. And basically, every vaccine that's ever been approved by FDA gets onto that list for the most part. They don't reject I don't even know if they've ever rejected anything that has come to them. And what happens is they then, go to every individual state and they promote every one of these vaccines, and then the states say, okay, we're going to adopt that as well. Well, she leaves that position and she goes to run the vaccine division of Merck. I mean, if that's not a conflict of interest, I don't know what is, but it's a great reflection of this revolving door that exists between our federal government and federal agencies and the corporate world. And the average American is suffering as a result of it, in my opinion.
Yeah, that is true. And in regards to the government, Alex Jones many times on his show has said there is no law saying you must take vaccines. I mean, there were a couple of exceptions he pointed out here and there, but of course, if you really want to get technical, the things we call laws are not laws. They are actually what is considered to be public policy by someone in the legislature or courts. It's not a law unless it's the U.S. Constitution or went through all the legal process in the legislature and then signed into law by the governor. But in regards to that, any law that the federal government tries to impose upon the several states is null and void. The federal government does not have any authority other than the 18 enumerated powers in the federal Constitution, and also protect us from outside threats, like in the event of a country that wants to go to war or something. So any law the federal government imposes in regards to vaccines is null and void right on its face. And same thing with the state governments trying to impose the law on the local governments. We do have the power to nullify it. But in regards to this subject, can you agree there is no law saying you must take vaccines in regards to what we consider laws? And also, what are some organizations that are requiring people to take vaccines, and if they refuse, they will pay a punishment for refusing?
Well, I completely agree that in the true sense and interpretation of law, there are no laws that require us to. With the way that things work in the United States today, what happens is FDA approves vaccines. then CDC develops CDC has an advisory committee on immunization practices called the ACIP, and they take those vaccines that FDA has approved and say, yes, we are going to recommend this for all 9-year-olds and above, or we're going to give this to all 2 months, we recommend it for 2 months old. So they develop this immunization schedule, the CDC vaccine schedule that's recommended, but it's not, they don't have any power whatsoever to implement that. They recommend it, and then what happens is most of the states, it's pretty much of a rubber stamp, take that, and they then pass rules or legislation in their states to try and require people to get them. And so it really depends. It varies from state to state. Some states, I think it's West Virginia and Mississippi, only allow medical exemption to vaccination. So they've passed legislation that requires every child to be vaccinated if they want to attend school or daycare, unless they can obtain a medical exemption from a physician, which is nigh on impossible to get. 48 states accept religious exemptions, so you can object on religious grounds, although some states are really, really horrible about it. New York actually has these religious kind of sincerity tests that they subject people to, which is a violation of the Constitution, as you know. You're supposed to be free, and you're not supposed to have to explain your religion. You're supposed to be allowed to pursue it without, any kind of question. It's supposed to be unfettered, and that's not what's happening. So, New York, some people have taken a little hidden camera in with them, and they've met with with officials from the state of New York who have literally grilled them and cross-examined them about their faith, which is a clear violation of the Constitution, but it's happening. So then other states, it's somewhere between 18 and 20 states. I'm not sure exactly how many have it now because it changes a little bit from time to time, but about 20 states offer what are called philosophical or conscientious belief exemptions, meaning that you can choose for whatever reason to abstain from vaccinations. But there are a bunch of other issues and loopholes. So part of the Patriot Act, or under the Patriot Act, there was legislation that was put forth by, I want to say, it was Bill Frist and Senator Frist and Hastert, Denny Hastert, about 5 years ago. They attached a piece of legislation to an energy bill, I believe it was, either energy or defense. And it specifically stated that in the event of a pandemic, so if the president declares a pandemic for flu in the United States, that special powers are granted to the government and that citizens can be forcibly vaccinated against their will. So, this is very, very convoluted and, pretty draconian stuff that they are passing in D.C., which, clearly violates our God-given rights, but that's what they're doing. And then you asked about the organizations that people can look to. Was that what you asked, Andrew?
Well, I was talking about organizations or groups or companies or whatever that punish people for refusing to take a vaccine, either not hire them or kick them out or some form of punishment for refusing.
It's horrific.
Vaccine.
There were dozens and dozens of nurses that had their jobs for 15 and 20 years this past year who were fired from their jobs for refusing flu vaccines. I remember the horrifying story of a pregnant nurse who was fired for refusing a flu vaccine when that vaccine, contained mercury. It's crazy. And yes, employers are doing this. Most of the ones that are doing it right now are healthcare organizations, but they're requiring people who have no contact with the public and to get flu vaccines or lose their jobs. It's crazy. I don't understand how anyone can think it's ethical, let alone legal, to subject someone to a medical procedure that can take their life. I don't get that in order to be employed. And then of course we just got I live in the state of Idaho, and there's a fight going on between a gentleman in Moscow with the city of Moscow. His daughter has been banned from daycare. Now, it is state law in Idaho that you can exempt your child from a vaccination for any reason you choose. It can be medical, it can be religious, or any reason. And yet the city of Moscow has passed an ordinance saying that they will only accept medical and religious exemptions. And that the religious exemption, they want to know where it specifically says in your religion that you can't give a vaccination to your child. And state, this is in clear contradiction to state law, but this is what they're doing. And this little girl has been banned now from nursery school, and there's a fight going on. And I've been in contact with several senators who are working to try and get to the bottom of this and figure stuff out. But basically, there are, these vigilantes who think that it's their job or their right to go and enforce vaccines because they believe. I think that there's a faith in vaccines as more of a religion than there is about the science and the true understanding. We've been told for decades that they're responsible for eradicating illness, that they are responsible for the low levels of disease mortality that we see in the Western world, that they can do no harm, all these things, and those are just not true. But the problem is that this meme has been out there for so many decades that most people just believe it, and then you've got these well-meaning people who go out and take it into their own hands and become a little bit crazy about it, I think, and this is what's happening. So this kind of stuff is happening across the nation, Andrew, where there are school nurses who are calling children into their offices and vaccinating those kids for sexually transmitted diseases against the express written wishes of the parents. This is happening. You look at the state of California, they passed legislation last year that allows children 12 and older to be vaccinated for sexually transmitted diseases without parental consent. So it's employers, it's schools, it's nurses. I mean, I hear stories constantly about people who have a baby in the hospital. They've told the hospital staff that they don't want their child to receive the hepatitis B vaccine, and the do-gooder nurse whisks the child away and vaccinates the kid without parental consent. I mean, this is criminal. This is a crime. It's assault with a deadly weapon. And that probably sounds really severe, but it's true. Vaccines do kill some people. That's above any kind of dispute or discussion. It's enshrined in federal law, which states that vaccines can injure and kill. In 1986, Ronald Reagan signed into law the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act, which recognized that vaccines injure and kill some children. So this is not, I'm not being crazy here or extreme when I say this. This is the fact, and yet these people are taking, they're assaulting children who are innocent and whose parents don't want them to be given these vaccines. It's criminal. I don't know how else you can look at it.
Yeah, it is criminal. And I also want to talk about problems that vaccines cause in terms of diseases and health for people. We'll get into specific diseases, but one specific one that I want to start off with, autism. Vaccines, shots cause autism, although from what I've looked into this, it appears that it depends on the type of autism. Like Asperger's syndrome is not a form of autism that would be caused by flu shots and vaccines, but there are other types of autism that would be caused by vaccines and flu shots. So just on autism specifically, which autistic spectrum disorders are connected to vaccine problems?
Can I just circle back one thing on what we were just talking about, the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act? It's really important, Andrew, that listeners know that one of the reasons that these healthcare providers can vaccinate your children without your consent is that they really shouldn't do it, but they're not accountable. You can't sue them if anything goes wrong. There's no liability from any vaccine provider in the United States. So nobody who administers a vaccine, nobody who creates a vaccine, nobody who distributes a vaccine, nobody can be sued if a vaccine injures you or your child. And this, of course, creates a very, very twisted situation where they have all upside financially and reputationally from giving vaccines and no downside because, vaccines are this kind of religion where they're doing good and they have no liability when vaccines go wrong. So it's really created this very twisted situation in our nation, and it's very, very sad. I just want people to understand that this is, why I think we have this bizarre situation, and it's so difficult to do anything about it. So now autism. I am not familiar with Asperger's not being related to vaccines, but that doesn't mean anything. I've never read specific research that says that vaccines aren't connected. What I can tell you is that there is a mountain of science that connects vaccines to autism. There is a mountain of science connecting mercury to autism, and there's growing science connecting aluminum to autism. So let's just start, first of all, with vaccines in general. Several people have done reviews of all the scientific literature and have amassed all the studies that connect vaccines to autism. And there's a website called Adventures in Autism, which is the blog of a mother of a child with autism who regressed into autism after vaccines. And she's compiled over 80 studies that put together connect the dots and help people to understand how vaccines are connected to autism. So over 80 studies that are connecting autism to vaccines. And then if you look at the mercury situation, there are literally hundreds of studies that link mercury to autism and other neurological damage and complications. And there is a scientist named Catherine DeSoto at the University of Northern Iowa who did a review of all of the empirical studies evaluating mercury, not just mercury in vaccines, but just mercury in general, and scientific studies that investigated whether there was a connection between mercury and autism. And her review found that the body of science favored a link by a factor of 3 to 1. But that doesn't stop health authorities from proclaiming that there's no connection. It's truly unbelievable. And the thing is, the mainstream media doesn't tell the truth because who are some of their biggest advertisers? Well, the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, you can't turn on the TV without seeing half a dozen pharmaceutical ads, can you? And so, I mean, they know where their bread is buttered, don't they? So this notion that there's no connection between mercury and autism is just absurd. And there have been a couple of papers that have been put out showing that, or connecting mercury to autism. One of them looked at infants, and what they found was that the children who have autism, infants who have autism, have way less mercury in their hair than kids who don't have autism. In fact, the kids who don't have autism have 2.5 times as much mercury in their first cut of baby hair as kids who do have autism. So what that's telling us is that the children who have autism have some inability to get the mercury out of their systems. They can't excrete it. There's some impairment there, and they've got some, problem with it. Additionally, there was research looking into the hepatitis B shot that was given, and it was the hepatitis B shot that was given that contained mercury because hepatitis B shots, they've taken all of or most of the mercury out. But if you looked at boys who received the mercury-laden hepatitis B shot at birth, they were 3 times more likely to have autism than the control group who didn't receive hepatitis B at birth. It appears that the biggest insult is in the first month of life. And then if you look at kids who received all 3 doses of the hepatitis B series, those boys, this is all boys, those boys were 9 times as likely as the control group who didn't receive all 3 of the hepatitis B shots to have special education needs. So those are just a few of the studies that tell you about, that point to a real issue with respect to mercury. And then there was one other thing, and this ties in the whole coal-fired power plant thing, is that there is also research showing that if the closer you live to a coal plant, the more likely your child is to have autism. I think it's within 70 miles, a 70-mile radius of a coal-fired power plant, the incidence of autism is much higher in those kids than it is outside of that. So that's just the mercury. And then if you look at aluminum, like I said, there's growing evidence that aluminum is linked as well, and aluminum, of course, is another metal. And aluminum really hasn't been in very wide use until recently, but it's been in vaccines and when I say recently, I mean in the last, several decades. It's not something that we used 100 years ago. and in fact, there's a fantastic film that people should see called The Age of Aluminum, which talks all about aluminum, its toxicity. We now know that aluminum causes cognitive impairment and neurological damage in full-grown adults. We know it causes inflammatory conditions. We know it's causing gastrointestinal problems, cancer, and other things. This is where the research is really digging in and finding that it's so much more dangerous than people ever believed. And yet it's been used in vaccines for 70 years without really any research into the side effects. This is just happening now, this stuff that's coming out in the last couple of years. And some scientists have gone and regressed the amount of aluminum in childhood vaccines against the rates of autism in different countries around the world, and they have found that there's a very, very clear connection, incredibly strong from a statistical standpoint. In fact, strong enough, according to a scientific method called Hill's criteria, in order to prove causation. So they believe they've proved causation, but they don't actually say that because they would get ripped on by the scientific community. But basically, according to Hill's criteria, they have proved that aluminum is causative in autism, and that there's a clear link between the amount of aluminum that children are receiving in their vaccines around the world and the amount of autism in that society. So, this notion that vaccines are not causing autism is simply not supported by the scientific literature. And on top of that, it's really important for listeners to understand that even our governments say that is true. The Italian government last year paid out compensation or granted compensation to a family whose son developed autism after the MMR shot. And the Italian government said, yes, MMR caused this boy's autism. They didn't mince words. They were very, very clear about it. And in the United States as well, there have been over 1,000 children who've been compensated for all sorts of neurological impairment after vaccinations and whose neurological impairment went on to cause autism, but they say that the vaccine didn't cause the autism. I mean, that's semantics. It's absurd. It's, the U.S. government and the National Vaccine Compensation Program admits that vaccines cause encephalopathy or brain damage, and that encephalopathy can lead to autism, but they maintain that the vaccines don't cause autism. I don't know how you can possibly argue that unless you are just trying to obfuscate, and I think that's pretty clear that's what they're trying to do. They don't want the over 1 million kids in America who have autism and their families to go and sue the federal government because, well, that wouldn't be very pretty, would it? So for all those people who say that, there's no evidence, there's no science, there's no proof, the U.S. government has conceded it. There have been several cases in the last year that they've conceded where vaccines cause encephalopathy that then led to autism, and that, like I say, in the last 15 years, there've been, I think it's like 1,300 cases where the U.S. government conceded that vaccines caused neurological impairment, and that led to autism and other conditions. And what they say is autism symptoms or symptoms of autism or autism-like symptoms. I mean, it's just a game of words, it's pure semantics. So I hope that gives you enough, Andrew. I know that was a big brain dump.
Well, it was very informative, and since you said you didn't look into the whole thing about vaccines and Asperger's syndrome, I might as well tell you this, but I just want to caution you, it does require a little bit of a leap of faith. It has been said among metaphysics experts and consciousness researchers that people with Asperger's syndrome were actually seeded on this earth by entities, you might even want to call them extraterrestrials, who were put on earth to raise the vibration of this world and wake up humanity out of its slumber, because many people with Asperger's have some unique trait that can somehow help humanity, like Einstein was supposedly said to have Asperger's, and look what he did in regard to physics. So I know this requires a huge leap of faith, but that's the evidence that people with Asperger's are not poisoned. They're just seeded here by guardian angels of sorts who are trying to help humanity. Well, now that I've told you that, can you offer any comment on Asperger's and vaccines?
I would just say that vaccines are known to cause brain damage. We know for a fact that vaccines cross the blood-brain barrier. HPV vaccines that were licensed on the market in 2006 have been documented to enter the brain of fully grown adults and kill them. But the thing is, how do we know that they're not that the only damage they cause is negative. We don't know that. We don't know we can't get inside someone's brain and understand what those different compounds might be doing. So I guess this is pure speculation on my part, but I could certainly see how vaccines could go into certain parts of the brain and cause impairment, but might cause enhancement in other parts of the brain, if that makes sense. So I could see how, and the thing is, many people argue about their kids with Asperger's and with regressive autism and different kinds of autism, that they're more open spiritually than other people are, that they are more connected in some ways. Maybe what's happening, and I think about, what's that woman who wrote, she was a neurologist, I think, or some kind of a brain scientist, and she had a stroke. Jill Bolte Taylor, is that her name? And it's called My Stroke of Insight, where she actually felt her left brain shut down. And and she basically saw the whole world around her. All that she thought was physical and real and hard melted in front of her very eyes because that kind of rational part of her brain shut down. And what she saw was that we were all energy, we were all connected. And I guess I could very easily see that vaccines might be shutting down certain parts of the brain that we can't shut down when we live in our rational mind, if that makes sense. And therefore, maybe that plays a role. But it's pure speculation, Andrew.
Okay, and we might as well get into some other diseases that fall outside of the autistic spectrum disorder that are very prominent as a result of vaccine poisoning. Could you elaborate on that to the best of your knowledge?
Oh, gosh. How much time do we have?
We have like 53 minutes, and there are a couple of other subjects, so I guess I could give you 25 minutes of this if you need it. So
I'm kind of kidding.
You got 25
I'm just saying
minutes on
the list is just huge, Andrew. I mean, we're talking about a huge spectrum of neurological damage, cognitive impairment, and dysfunction. We're talking about, you think about it, ADHD, learning disabilities, speech delays, autism, auditory processing problems, all these things. They're neurological impairment. They're neurological problems. And then if you look at Alzheimer's, big connection with aluminum. Of course, mainstream medicine still likes to say it's not the case, but there's a growing body of science that does prove that's the case. And I know a scientist who has been treating patients, not his patients because he's not generally a clinician, but he's doing a study, and he's looked at, he's taken the people on the study and who all have Alzheimer's, and he's been giving them salicylic acid. Salicylic acid binds with aluminum in the body, and what he's doing is halting and in some cases reversing the onset of Alzheimer's. So getting the aluminum out is, helping these people, stopping and reversing their Alzheimer's. To say that it's not caused by vaccinations or the aluminum in vaccinations just makes no sense when you look at that kind of research, So, this huge spectrum of neurological impact, memory problems, look at all the people. I remember when I was a kid, there were lots and lots of elderly people who were super sharp and super on their game. And nowadays it seems like, a lot of people hit a certain age and it's down the road. And nowadays the exception is the super lucid 95-year-old rather than that being the norm. We've got, and to say that it's only vaccines, that would be ridiculous because, like I said, there's mercury in our air, which causes damage, neurological damage. There's so many toxins in what we eat and all over our planet. So I wouldn't argue it's just from vaccinations, but there's clearly a connection between the metals in vaccinations and these neurological impairments. And if you look at research in the United States, there was a study published in Academic Pediatrics a couple of summers ago, and that study found that 54% of American school kids are chronically ill. It also found that 20% of them have a developmental disability, some kind of neurological problem, developmental disability. That's a staggering number, 1 in 5 American kids today. So, we're talking about a huge, huge impact. And, of course, there is science that connects these things to vaccinations. What are some of the other issues? Inflammatory conditions. So we're talking about inflammatory conditions and autoimmune diseases. Lupus, multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, Lou Gehrig's disease, these are all conditions that are inflammatory and autoinflammatory in nature, and there is science connecting them to vaccinations. We know that DPT vaccinations, diphtheria, pertussis, and tetanus vaccinations, can cause rheumatoid arthritis. We know that there have been tons and tons of reports of a variety of demyelinating diseases, which are things like MS and ALS, which is where the myelin sheath around the nerves in our central nervous system is damaged. It's a fatty sheath that lines, that covers all the nerves, and it's damaged. And that's been very, very common in girls who suffered vaccine reactions after the Gardasil vaccine and the Cervarix vaccines for HPV. We see these in older people as well, but so there's a huge spectrum of those kinds of things. And then we have tons and tons of people with gut issues. I mean, how many people have allergies today? Food allergies that were non-existent 30 years ago. Something like I think it's about 2/3 of all kids who have regressive autism, meaning that they were developing normally and then they regressed into autism at some point in their lives. Something like 2/3 of them have gut issues, have gastrointestinal problems. These kids have chronic constipation or chronic diarrhea. They have failure to thrive. They have all sorts of problems. And, there's a connection between vaccines and this. And what's the irony is that now the vaccine industry is trying to develop a vaccine to protect against the unchecked growth of some of the pathogens that are causing this, that was started by vaccines in the first place. It's staggering, but that's what they're saying, that there's no connection between MMR, autism, and gut issues, and then they turn around, a couple of years later and say that they're going to try to develop a vaccine for the gut issues and autism. I mean, it's just beggars belief. We have allergies and asthma. It goes on and on and on. So many problems. Chronic fatigue. I can't even think of everything, but that's a good list. Diabetes, obesity. There are scientists who are arguing that the diabetes and obesity epidemics are triggered by vaccines, and that type 1 and type 2 are basically your body either reacts in one of two ways. It either just stops producing insulin, which is type 1 diabetes, and there's an epidemic of that in children today, or that your body just becomes impaired in terms of its ability to react to insulin, and that's the type 2, and the whole metabolic syndrome, and obesity. So these are all things that are linked to vaccinations, despite the fact that, mainstream health authorities will tell us that there is none. And then now I'm going to talk about something that is very, very sensitive and very, very touchy, and that is infant death. A couple of scientists went and looked at, now infant death isn't exactly a disease, but or an illness, but it is certainly a factor after vaccination. I think it's really important for people to understand it. There have been two really important pieces of research done in my mind on this. One was something that vaccinated premature infants with single and multi-dose vaccinations, and then looked at what happened to them from a cardiovascular standpoint. So did they, what were their oxygen levels like? Did they need to be resuscitated? What did their hearts do? What did their inflammation markers do, and things like that? And they were doing it on premature infants, so these kids were being monitored so they could actually find out what was going on with them. And the results were staggering. They only looked at a couple hundred kids, but the incidence of reactions was huge. I think something like 30% of the kids had to be resuscitated, given oxygen, or in some other way treated, and basically, retrieved from dying. A good percentage of them died. Many of them had their CRP levels, which are C-reactive protein, a marker for inflammation, skyrocketed in the first day or 2 days after the vaccinations. And, this research basically showed that there was a very, very high number of kids stopping breathing, kids needing to be reoxygenated, and kids, babies needing to be resuscitated, and then a good portion of them died. And yet this research has never been followed up on. It's amazing to me, but it hasn't. So, this idea that babies just stop breathing in their sleep for no known reason probably doesn't hold water, because we know what the reason is, and that is that these babies are stopping breathing probably because the vaccines are damaging some part of their brainstem, which is responsible for breathing. And we also know from research in monkeys that vaccines do impair that part of the brainstem in monkeys who are given childhood vaccinations. So that's one really staggering piece of research. And then the other piece of research I was going to talk about is these scientists who went and they looked at the vaccination schedule around the entire world, and they looked at infant mortality in those different nations. So they looked at the vaccine schedule in individual countries, and they regressed that against the infant mortality in each of those countries. And what they found was that the countries that gave between 24 and 26 vaccines in the first year of life had an infant mortality rate twice that of the countries who only gave 11 to 14 vaccines in the first year of life. So the United States leads the pack at 26 doses of 9 vaccines in the first year. Britain, Australia are right there on our heels with somewhere in the 23 to 26 range. And all of those countries have an infant mortality rate that is about twice that of Sweden, Japan, and Singapore, who only give 11 to 14 vaccines in the first year of life. Now, that doesn't prove that the vaccines are causing infant mortality, but it's certainly something to be very, very concerned about. And, I would think that health authorities would be falling all over themselves to investigate this, but instead what they do is actually say nothing. Literally, they do not comment on it. It's really, really, really tragic. So I think it's really important to understand that the thousands of kids who are dying from sudden infant death in this country each year may not be dying from sudden infant death. It is, possibly vaccine death. So that really gives you a kind of a, big overview of the spectrum of injuries from vaccines. The only thing I didn't really go into much detail about is other kinds of allergies. We have an epidemic of peanut allergies. I don't know how many schools in America still allow kids to have peanuts in school or any nuts, but certainly not in my neighborhood they don't. And there's growing science that it's due to vaccinations and molecular mimicry from some of the components in vaccines that actually make the body think that they make the body react to something that looks a lot like peanuts, and then they develop a severe anaphylactic kind of vaccine to it. So, this is just a spectrum of injury that's happening after vaccines, and I think that's one of the problems. If you look across the nation, it's not like we have 54% of the kids have some kind of chronic illness, but they don't all have the same illness. And so because it's not the same, it's easy for people to dismiss it and say, there's just a lot of diabetes, or there's a lot of asthma, or there's a lot of allergies, or, something like that. And it's not linked to vaccines. It's kind of, the walking wounded, all these people who are walking around chronically ill who require all sorts of medical interventions just to carry on their lives, and who have become fantastic patients for the pharmaceutical industry, but clearly not very, are going to struggle to lead as productive of lives as they might have had, had they not been vaccine damaged. And yet we don't, we can't see the smoking gun because they're so varied. What's important to understand is that the CDC has never done a study comparing the health outcomes of vaccinated to unvaccinated children. And no pharmaceutical company's ever done that either. So we've never done a controlled clinical study evaluating what happens when we give kids 48 doses of 14 vaccines before their 6th birthday. What happens when we give them 26 doses of 9 vaccines before their 1st birthday? What happens to them after 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years? What happens to them? We just don't know. And it's unconscionable that we are doling out all these vaccines when we don't know what the true medium and long-term ramifications are. But some very industrious and brave people have conducted surveys. So they're not as scientific as a controlled clinical study, but they do give us important information. And there have been a couple of surveys like this. There was one in New Zealand done over a decade ago, I believe, that looked at kids who were vaccinated, over 1,000 kids who were vaccinated, and a small group, I think it was only slightly over 30, who were unvaccinated. But it found that there was basically no asthma, no allergies in the kids who were unvaccinated, and a very, very high percentage, 1 in 7 or 1 in 9 kids, some high number of kids had allergies and asthma in the vaccinated group. In general, the kids who were unvaccinated had much better health than the kids who were vaccinated. And then there's a bigger survey that was done in the United States looking at kids who have autism, and I believe it was 17,000 kids and about 12,000 families. And they compared those who were vaccinated and to those who were not vaccinated, and they found that boys who were vaccinated were 2.5 times as likely to have autism as boys who hadn't been vaccinated. Now, again, that's a survey, so it's not as robust as a controlled clinical study, but it's certainly very telling, isn't it? And then there's been a bigger survey that's being done out of Germany, but it's getting data from people all over the nation, all over the world, rather. And what's happened is they have asked people to report on their children's health and well-being. Tell us about your children who are vaccinated. Tell us about your children who are not vaccinated. What kinds of illnesses and things do they have? And they have found that the kids who are unvaccinated are way, way healthier than the kids who are vaccinated. So the survey basically shows that kids who are vaccinated have 2 to 5 times as many health problems as the kids who are unvaccinated. And all of this kind of informal survey stuff is really, really important and pointing in the right direction. The problem is that health authorities won't follow up on it. I mean, CDC has basically, refused to do a study comparing the vaccinated to unvaccinated kids, and so it's kind of up to you to figure out, who you're going to believe and who you're going to trust. I know that was a lot of information, but it's a huge, huge topic, Andrew.
I understand. Maybe we'll get into this again if we still have time and I'm out of ideas to discuss. But there are some other things to discuss here. What about the extent to which the military gets vaccines? Have you done any research on that?
Oh, it's heartbreaking, Andrew. That is
Please discuss
heartbreaking. It. What's that?
Please talk about the military and vaccines.
Yeah. Well, the military are basically used as guinea pigs. They are given vaccines. I mean, they've been given an anthrax vaccine that's never even been FDA approved, so it's an experimental vaccine, and they are lined up and they are given as many as 16 vaccines at one time. We've interviewed, when we were making the greater good, we interviewed veterans who literally were stripped to their shorts and then lined up and marched through these lines where they were given a vaccine in each arm and each thigh, and each of those shots contained 4 different vaccines. If they ask for documentation about what they've been given, they oftentimes can't get it. There's an epidemic of diseases that are usually middle-aged and elderly diseases like ALS in our young military veterans. So basically, if you look at the populations of people who've deployed and not deployed, like to the first Gulf War, there were very similar levels of people with ALS. Now, ALS usually affects people in their 50s and 60s, not in their 20s, and yet there was a very, very large population relative to the normal population in the military veterans. And so a scientist named Chris Shaw from the University of British Columbia went and investigated what they were being given, and he actually took the aluminum hydroxide that was in the anthrax vaccine and in many other vaccines, and he gave it to mice and in dose appropriate amounts, and he found that the mice became confused, that their muscles became weak, their coordination was bad, they became kind of apprehensive and also aggressive in some ways, like their social dynamics changed. They were impaired cognitively, they were impaired physically, and then when they sacrificed the animals and opened up their brains, they found that parts of their brains responsible for motor function over 30% of the cells in those parts of their brain had killed themselves. They were dead. And as Chris Shaw says, nobody in his lab wants to ever get vaccinated again after having seen that, because it was just terrifying, and they weren't expecting it. They weren't out to poke holes in vaccines, but oh my gosh, 30, I think it was 2 or 3% of the brain cells in this part of the brain were dead. Now, ALS is a horrific disease where your body, your muscle, your brain's control over your muscles slowly deteriorates, and you ultimately suffocate to death or choke to death because your body can't even control that kind of muscle tissue. And it's horrific, and we know that this is happening from the aluminum in vaccines in mice, and yet we're still giving it to infants and to our military in very, very high amounts. So that study was done on the anthrax vaccine, and looking specifically because of what Dr. Shaw found in the Gulf War syndrome victims. That's one thing. And then the other thing I wanted to share about this is, some of the stories we've heard from military veterans. We interviewed this one young man whose father and grandfather had both been in the military. These were people who had given a huge amount to our country. And he was one of those who was lined up, literally marched through this room in his shorts, with guns around, literally, and vaccinated with all these things. He was injected. He didn't even know what with. And he went to Iraq. He deployed, and he was in the field, and he collapsed. He didn't know what happened, but he basically lost consciousness. And he was gotten out of there, and he was life-flighted to Germany, strangely. And he'd already had a long military career, but and he had a long medical record. He'd fallen off of buildings and had broken bones and this and that. And he said that his medical file was half an inch or an inch thick, because of all the different things that had happened to him in his career. And he was taken into this hospital, and he was operated on. And they basically said all he was told was that his insides, his guts had disintegrated. He had a bunch of his intestines and stuff removed, but he doesn't know what was happened. When he was discharged, he received a piece of paper, literally a half a page, and that was his new medical record. He has no idea what's happened to his medical record, and he can't get it. And basically, they just purged his medical record of anything after he was given all those vaccines, and his insides melted. That's how he described it. He then went to years later, he went to a VA hospital, and he's done this several times, where he goes in and he says, listen, I can't sleep. I have sleep disorders. Just as an aside, lots of kids with autism have sleep disorders. I can't eat very well. I have gut issues. I have all these problems. I have headaches. On and on and on and on. I have all these problems. And they'll be like, well, look, we're going to help you. We're going to help you. Sit down. Let's talk. And then they go and they look up his name and they do something, and they come back and they say, what do you want? We'll give you money. How much do you want? They literally have tried to pay him off. And he's like, I don't want money. I want to get better. They've offered to pay him 5 or 6 times what he was given initially as his, compensation. I don't know if it's his pension or what, for being a veteran. And he's like, I don't want money, but this has happened over and over and over again. And then he gets harassed, and then he ultimately gets chucked out. There's a cover-up going on, a clear cover-up going on. And he says that mosquitoes won't even come within a couple of feet of him because they can smell some, toxicity or something in him. So who knows what he's been injected with. But anyway, this is kind of some of the stuff that happens to our military. And they really have no choice. They are, basically chucked out if they don't go along with it. So it's really, really tragic.
Indeed. And want to go into another subject here, raw milk, because it mentioned that on your description on the greater good, you did work in regards to trying to get people to be able to consume raw milk, and I guess we'll talk about this for a little bit, and maybe some other food if you've done any research on that. But what is it about raw milk that makes it better to drink than the kind of milk we usually drink, and why did you get into this?
Okay. Well, just through making the whole vaccine, making the greater good, and I should tell listeners, go to greatergoodmovie.org to our website, and you can watch the trailer, and you can stream the video and look at our catalog of science of over 200 research studies and case reports documenting and exploring adverse reactions to vaccines. So don't ever let somebody tell you that there's no science, because there are hundreds of studies out there connecting vaccines to these things I'm talking about. Anyway, I used to really think that vaccines were a great thing. I grew up to believe that they were one of the greatest inventions of humankind. I always vaccinated myself. I got flu vaccines in my late 20s and early 30s. Before I went to Southeast Asia in my late 20s, I went and got every vaccine they would give me before I went to Southeast Asia. And my health got worse and worse during that period of time, and I never connected the two until about 2 or 3 years ago, and then I started to realize that this all happened then. But I tell you this story because I was never somebody who doubted that vaccines were great. I was never somebody who thought that there might be any downside to them or a problem. And I also really trusted the government, and I trusted medical authorities. I trusted that they were doing what was best for me, and that whatever they advised was in my best interest. So I didn't care about health freedom, and I ate well, but I ate well according to what federal health authorities told me. So I avoided fat and stuff like that, which we now know is actually dangerous. It's not healthy. The point being that I started investigating vaccines, and it kind of opened up a Pandora's box for me. Because once I started to read the science and the lack of science about vaccines, I started to wonder about other things. And I then started to look into food issues. And I also developed after all those vaccines, I developed food allergies and some really bad problems, night sweats and other things, headaches and chronic sore throats and allergies to a bunch of things like gluten and stuff that I'd never had before. And so I started investigating the food system, and what I found was that our food system is not what our food system used to be. So, when, 50 or 60 years ago, when somebody went and bought a piece of bread, they were buying a piece of bread that had some kind of wheat that wasn't sprayed in 50 different chemicals, and that had probably been, had some healthy yeast put in it to raise it, and that was it. And it might have a little bit of oil or lard in it as a fat or something like that, but it didn't have canola or soy oil in it. It didn't have soy flour in it. It didn't have genetically modified seeds in it. It didn't have synthetic oils. It didn't have tons of pesticides. If you went and bought a hamburger, even if you went to McDonald's and you bought a hamburger, you weren't getting something that was laced with steroids and antibiotics and hormones and chemicals that mimic estrogen and other hormones in the bodies. You get the picture. You weren't getting that. You were getting something that was food for the most part. And I started reacting to food so badly. I could have a sip of a glass of wine and then develop a migraine for 5 days. I could have a sandwich and bloat up 2 sizes in my pants, my suit. And I couldn't figure out what was going on, so I started reading about all this, and I started reading about how our food was laced with all of these different things and that our food wasn't our food anymore. And then I got involved with an organization called the Weston A. Price Foundation, which is dedicated to healing through traditional diets, meaning the way that people ate hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and also to helping protect and further sustainable farming. So, crop rotation and heirloom seeds and organic and biodynamic and all these things, so that our soil is rich, our foods are nutrient dense, our foods are healthy and nourishing to our bodies, and that we're healthy because a healthy body resists disease. And so I started just, doing all this research and learning about this and realizing that, I actually really better, 1, educate myself, and 2, I better protect my own health freedoms because they're being taken away, not only in vaccines but elsewhere. FDA came out probably 2 years ago and said that it is not your right to decide what you put into you or your family's mouth. Isn't that amazing, Andrew? They're actually federal authorities, federal agencies say that it's their job and their business to decide how you eat. So it's not your right to eat raw milk if you want to or drink raw milk if you want to. You shouldn't have that right, and therefore they're going to fight it. Thankfully, they don't have total control, and you can fight at the state level to get raw milk introduced into your state. And so I did that. I worked with a friend who has a large organic raw dairy in the state of Idaho, and with the Idaho State Department of Agriculture, and we got legislation approved that would allows raw milk to be sold as long as it comes from a facility that is either a grade A licensed facility, so a big licensed facility, or else it comes from a small operation with 3 cows or less that produces raw milk and is tested every few months to make sure that they are healthy animals. And so you can buy raw milk in the state of Idaho now. And raw milk is indeed much healthier than the average stuff you buy in the grocery store shelf for a variety of reasons. Number one, the animals are healthier. So if you go to a major dairy, they are routinely giving the animals antibiotics in their feed. They are giving them growth hormones. People remember all this. I'm sure I've heard about and seen labels that say, RBGH free or RBST free. Those are recombinant growth hormones that are banned in Europe and in Canada, but we use here. And those things are given to cows, and there are traces of those in their milk and in their meat. So you're getting those. You're getting hormones, you're getting steroids, you're getting antibiotics, and a big spectrum of things that you probably don't want to be eating in your food, in your milk in particular. And then it's also, all the cows are in such confined quarters, and they're being fed food that's not their native diet. So cows are ruminants. They have 4 stomachs. They're supposed to eat grass and maybe a very small amount of grain and other things like peas and stuff. They are not supposed to be eating corn and soy, which is the standard ration given to cows in confined animal feed operations and dairy, in confined dairy operations. And so what happens to these animals when they're given a diet of corn and soy, which they're not supposed to eat, is that their digestive systems tracts become inflamed and infected. And so these cows have lots and lots of pus in their milk. And this brings me to the reason that we pasteurize. We pasteurize because these are diseased animals and their milk is diseased. And if you don't pasteurize it, it's going to have a lot of bugs in it that you obviously don't want to be ingesting. And so that's why they pasteurize it. And raw milk is unpasteurized. So when you pasteurize it, you heat it to about 180 degrees. And it kills off all of the bugs, the bad bugs. The problem is it kills off the good bugs too. And it also damages the enzymes. So raw milk contains a spectrum of enzymes that help you to digest it, which may be one reason why a lot of people have problems digesting dairy, is because the enzymes are severely damaged. And raw milk also contains lots of gosh, I lost my train of thought. So it contains lots of the good bugs. So, it used to be well known in the medical field in the early part of the 20th century that raw milk was this healing elixir. In fact, seriously sick people were oftentimes put on raw milk diets and they were healed because raw milk has a huge spectrum of really, really good bugs in it, good bacteria that populate our guts. And 70-80% of our immune system is in our gut. And our immune system is really about the balance between the so-called good bugs and the bad bugs. And so raw milk helps those good bugs to flourish, and in turn keeps the bad bugs in check. So raw milk does all of these things, and milk from these confined animal feed operations and these high production dairies with 20, 30, 40, 100,000 animals in them don't have that. And then there's one more piece to the puzzle, Andrew, which is that animals who are fed corn and soy have different nutrients in their milk and in their tissues than animals who are fed their native diet, which is grass. A grass-fed piece of steak or grass-fed milk has a much higher amount of vitamin A, D, and K in it than does a comparable animal that's fed corn and soy. They also have something called conjugated linoleic acid in them, in their tissues, and that's super anti-inflammatory and super heart protective. So, drinking raw milk and drinking raw milk from pastured animals and eating meat from pastured animals is actually super heart healthy and cancer protective, whereas eating those products from our standard confined animal feed operations are detrimental to health. And it's really important to understand that vitamins A, D, and K are vital in many, many ways. A is critical to a healthy, functioning immune system. So is vitamin D, and they work synergistically. And vitamin K is also critical to that kind of little triumvirate of working with the immune system. But they also do lots of other things. Vitamin D tells your body to absorb calcium. The vitamin K tells your body where to put the calcium. The problem is that when you pasteurize milk, vitamin C and other things are damaged or destroyed in the process, and the vitamin D and the vitamin C work together to absorb the calcium, so it doesn't actually work if there's no vitamin C present. So you're not actually absorbing the D, and then if you're drinking milk that comes from an animal that doesn't have vitamin K in its tissues or secretions, its milk, then your body doesn't know where to put the calcium. It does absorb, and it ends up in our arteries and in our soft tissues. So think about kidney stones and gallstones and hardening of the arteries and stuff like that. These are calcifications, and there's research showing that it's because of a vitamin K deficient diet. So basically get out there and drink your pastured milk and eat your pastured eggs and your pastured meats, because it really helps with all these things. So basically that's a really kind of circuitous route to explain how I got interested in health issues. Basically vaccines took me down that rabbit hole, and it's the vaccine issue has helped me to understand that, it's up to each and every one of us to empower ourselves and to get involved, to protect our rights, to eat what we want, to use what medicines we want or not use the medicines, we don't want, and to basically lead our lives the way we want. And these things are actually, they seem disconnected, but they're actually incredibly connected in my heart and in my mind.
Yes, just to make sure people don't get confused, there was a moment where you said back there that you were told that eating fat is unhealthy, and so you shouldn't eat fat, and then you seemed to confuse the issue. You said eating fat is unhealthy. Well, just to clarify, you did mean to say that you should not avoid fat because we need fat, right?
Absolutely. Eating fat from pastured animals is incredibly healthy, so I apologize for the confusion. It's incredibly healthy, despite the fact that federal health authorities are constantly telling you to not eat fat, animal fat. And I'll just give you a couple data points, which I think are staggering. If it's true that saturated fat that comes from animals, is causing cancer and heart disease, then how do you reconcile the fact that at the turn of the 20th century, in the year 1900, Americans consumed 18 pounds of butter and a similar amount of lard? Lard is the fat that comes from pork. So that's how much they were consuming back then. In 1985, roughly 1985, Americans were consuming 0 lard and 4 pounds of butter a year. And look what's happened to the rates of cancer and heart disease in our country. Gone through the roof. They are epidemic. I think, like half of all men have a heart attack and a third of us will die from cancer? Clearly, the low-fat diet ain't happening. It's not the holy grail that we were promised. And more science is now coming out and proving that basically a low-fat diet is actually extremely dangerous.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Thank you for clarifying that, Andrew. I really appreciate it because I didn't realize.
It's okay. We got about 14 minutes left, so 2 more subjects I want to cover. Have you done any research on the subject of what Bill Gates, I believe he's talked about this, about mosquitoes that can be used as vaccines, and possibly that might lead into mechanical mosquitoes being used as vaccines created by maybe the military-industrial complex? Alex Jones did mention this a couple times on his show, but have you done any research on mosquitoes and mechanical mosquitoes maybe being used as vaccine things?
Those cute little drones.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, this is ongoing. They are definitely, I haven't done a huge amount, so I can't speak nearly in depth about that as I have about the other stuff, but there are efforts underway to utilize mosquitoes as vaccine vectors, basically to use them as a way to spread vaccines. That is something that's happening, and the mechanical ones. I mean, there are mock-ups and stuff. I haven't heard if any of this is functional yet, but I've heard that they're going to use these more as surveillance rather than as vaccine vectors. But it wouldn't surprise me if they'd be able to use them for both. I actually do think I read something about that a couple of years ago. But basically, there are literally hundreds of vaccines under development today. And there is this belief by some of these people who have ties to the New World Order, it would appear. I'm not going to go super far down that rabbit hole, but it does seem like, on the surface anyway, there are lots of people who connect them all. And it seems that, they're trying to use these things to, put these mosquitoes out there and these other insects that could actually spread vaccines. They say that they're not disease-laden, but of course they're disease-laden. They have to be. They've got to have a part of the disease or else it wouldn't work, And we have no idea what's going to happen when they do this. And then the other piece is, these drones that they're developing. And I'm sure lots of people have seen the mock-ups of them, but I actually haven't seen one that is for real. But they are tiny. They'll be able to go in through the crack in your door or under your door or land on your shirt and follow you into the house or whatever and then do what they're going to do. And it's pretty scary stuff. I don't know. I mean, I don't know what you do about it all, Andrew. I mean, gosh, wouldn't it be great if we could stop time? If we could just stop all this stuff, if we could just chuck all these people out who are literally perpetrating these crimes against humanity and the planet. I just hope that there is an upswelling of people who wake up to what's happening and just say no, because I think that's the only thing that's going to happen. There's no way that we're going to legislate changes. There's no way we're going to stop this in the existing channels. I mean, I think that the only way that all these things are going to stop is for enough people to reject the mainstream, reject the status quo. I don't know what your thoughts are on that. I'd love to hear what you think about it.
Well, it's just worth pointing out, don't really want to talk about this because I want to get this one final subject in, but it's worth pointing out that on the Police State episode of Conspiracy Theory with Jesse Ventura, they talked about how in order to round up all the people in the FEMA camps, by the way, if you haven't seen this episode, watch it. It only aired once on True TV because people got threatened because it aired. It is on YouTube. Watch it while it's still there. And in this episode, they talked about how they were going to put some sort of a disease out in the public to try to use the disease as justification for putting everybody into the FEMA camps. I don't know how much this ties into your work in regards to using vaccines and shots and needles to poison people, but it's definitely worth pointing that out. But I definitely want to...
What was the episode called, Andrew?
The Police State episode of Conspiracy Theory with Jesse Ventura. It's also it's mainly about the FEMA camps, but they talk about the release of the disease to justify putting everybody in the camps, and I don't know how much this would tie in with your work on poisonous shots and vaccines, so
well, listen, I have to tell you that this kind of stuff is already happening, and when I say that is, so before the swine flu, let's see, what do we call it, supposed pandemic, it wasn't a pandemic, it was a way less, basically it didn't really happen, in that there was no pandemic. The rate of people getting sick was way, way less than a normal flu season. But in the years prior to that, remember I talked about how there was this legislation inserted by Bill Frist and Denny Hastert that allowed the federal government to forcibly vaccinate you for flu in the event of a pandemic. That was passed in 2006 or 7, I think it was, and then we had the swine flu pandemic in 2009. Well, very interestingly, Baxter International is one of the producers of the swine flu vaccine, and we contracted with them and others, and many other governments contracted with Baxter International to produce swine flu vaccine for them. What's very, very interesting is that in the early part of 2009, well before the swine flu vaccine thing was supposedly breaking out, the news broke about it, a bunch of regular human, influenza flu vaccines were shipped to some Eastern Bloc countries, some Eastern European countries. And a scientist, I believe it was in the Czech Republic, pulled one of the vials open and tested it to see what the heck was in it, and it was just a flu vaccine, purely flu vaccine, supposedly. And what he found was that it had avian flu in it. It had bird flu in it. So this flu vaccine was tainted. It was just a flu vaccine, with like influenza A and B or whatever, and it was tainted with bird flu. Now, every vaccine maker on the planet is bound by law to practice biological hazard, protocol in dealing with these kinds of substances. So they have to have a separate facility in dealing with all these things. It is not possible that bird flu could have gotten into that vaccine by chance. It only happened because someone either did it deliberately or because somebody was messing around. Because Baxter wasn't following protocol. Anybody who was following protocol wouldn't, it's just not possible. So basically what happened was Baxter sent out thousands of those doses, thousands of doses of that vaccine that was tainted with bird flu. How the heck can you rationalize this? How can you justify what's happening here? What happens is the scientist discovers it. The scientist alerts global health authorities. An investigative reporter goes and starts getting on the story and digging deep, and she ends up silenced. I don't know what's happened to her. You haven't heard anything from her in a long, long time. But basically, months later, there's a swine flu pandemic around the world, and guess who's producing the swine flu vaccine? And the swine flu, let's remember, was a combination of something that's never happened in nature before. It wasn't just swine flu. The swine flu that was going around in 2009, supposedly, was a combination of regular human flu, swine flu, and bird flu. So there are scientists who believe that this was engineered in a lab and released to, injure the public. And it's interesting that it came within a short period of time of that legislation being passed in the United States. And also for people to understand that the United Nations Charter and World Health Organization, which is, part of the United Nations, states explicitly that all member nations must comply with World Health Organization health directives in the event a pandemic is declared. So basically, World Health Organization rules or dictates supersede your own domestic laws in the event that a pandemic is declared. And, it's very, very interesting timing of events, and it seems extremely implausible that that swine flu was just something that just naturally occurred in nature when it's never happened before. And it's very bizarre that you got swine flu, bird flu, and human flu all together in one little disease all of a sudden. Just doesn't make any sense. And that it happened right after Baxter released this vaccine, flu vaccine that was tainted with bird flu, and nothing's ever been done about it. And bizarrely, ironically, I don't know what you say, we then go and get flu vaccine from Baxter, swine flu vaccine from Baxter. It doesn't really add up, does it? So there is evidence of what you're talking about already. I just forgotten it until we started discussing it further.
Yeah, thank you for quickly covering that. We got about 5.5 minutes left, so one more thing I'll probably have to ask you to cover this on the fly. The New World Order folks do actually take vaccines, but their vaccines are healthy, and they do actually protect from diseases. They're not poison. Now, assuming we, the people of the general public, actually wanted to have access to vaccines that could be healthy and would protect us from diseases, what do we have to do? You got 5 minutes or so. Please try to cover it in 5 minutes, best of your ability.
Yeah. Andrew, I will cover it in less than 5 minutes because I really don't know the answer to that. What I do know is that Angela Merkel, the head of Germany, she and other senior officials in Europe have been able to supply their families with flu vaccines that do not have something called, oh my gosh, I cannot believe I'm blanking on it. It's made from shark oil, and it's the adjuvant that they use. Oh my gosh, that's so funny. Anyway, there's an adjuvant. So an adjuvant is used to stimulate an immune response because without adjuvants, vaccines don't really work. And so I'm going to look it up on my website right now. What happened was that these adjuvants are not approved in the United States, and they are generally viewed as being kind of dangerous. So aluminum, squalene, that's what it's called. Aluminum is an adjuvant used in lots of vaccines in the U.S. and around the world. And in the flu vaccines, the swine flu vaccines that were administered and the flu vaccines that are administered in Europe, they use squalene. Squalene is a derivative of shark oil, and it's known to cause all sorts of inflammatory problems. Well, what happened in Europe was that some of these people, like Angela Merkel's kids and or her family, were administered the flu vaccine absent the squalene. Now, whether it worked for them or not, I don't know, but the point is that squalene and that vaccine that was used in Europe is now known to have caused narcolepsy in tons and tons of kids. Narcolepsy is a disease, a neurological disease, so brain damage, that impairs a person's ability to regulate sleep cycles, and they just fall asleep. And I don't know how in the world anybody would go about getting a clean vaccine. You can get them absent squalene in the U.S. because it's not been used in the U.S., but they still have aluminum and all these other things. And I have to say, Andrew, I don't know that vaccines would work. I mean, one of the problems in the way that they started using aluminum in vaccines is because they weren't working in the labs in the 1930s and 40s. They were trying to develop vaccines, and they weren't eliciting an immune response. And so they threw alum, which is this aluminum powder, in there, and bingo, what? You know what happened? The immune system reacted. So if you take the aluminum out, you take the squalene out, you take the mercury and all the other garbage in there out, the detergents, the antibiotics and all this, and the DNA fragments, I don't know if it would do anything. But I still wouldn't want to inject it into me. I can tell you that.
Well, it's a matter of preference. We do have the right to choose, and even religious grounds, you said, won't be sometimes considered valid. Even if you try to use that, people will debate whether or not religions are a good idea or not, but that's not the issue. The issue is whether religion should be a justification for not taking a vaccine, and if you ask the Founding Fathers, the obvious answer would be yes. That's why they put freedom of religion in the First Amendment, because you can't be free unless you can't choose your own religion. So I do hope...
Andrew, I want to say something really clearly if I can.
Yeah.
If somebody wants to use a vaccine, by all means, I think they should have the right to do that. I am in no way saying that people shouldn't be able to use vaccines. I've just done enough research that I wouldn't put another one into my body at this point. But I think they should be as safe as possible. I think they should clean them up as much as they can, get rid of the toxins, and do proper research so they can be as safe as they can be for those who want to use them. But today I wouldn't do it. That's all I can say.
Yeah, I certainly
But I
wouldn't
totally
do it.
agree that it's everybody's right to choose what they put into their body. It's not the government. It's not mine, that's for sure.
Yeah, all the laws that say these drugs are illegal, government never actually had any authority to pass those in the first place. It's just one of those do what we say kind of things, and we're just letting them lock people up for it. So, well, with that being said, Leslie, this was a fascinating interview. I'm glad I was able, especially to get some stuff other than vaccines out. But since the show's coming to an end, I'm going to tell you the same thing I tell all my guests. One of my goals on this show, get as many different people on the show as possible before I start giving anyone double dips, because that's the fairest and best way to get information out. So don't expect a call from me in the near future to come on my show, because there's a lot of other fascinating individuals who deserve some glory on this radio show. But I loved having you. Thanks a lot, Leslie.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, Andrew.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Take care now. Keep up the good work. Hope to see you on Alex Jones sometime soon. All right.
Yeah,
talk to you later.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Well, that was fun, folks. Got to learn what's going to happen to you if you don't take care of your health. And, boy, worry about the children especially. Alex Jones once did a special report on vaccines and among other things, and he flat out pointed at the camera and said in that interview, in that special report, I am sick of what they're doing to children, especially with vaccines. Think of the children, they say. Well, that can be used as an excuse, as a brainwashing tactic by malevolent forces that think of the children thing, but this is different. You got to think of the children when it comes to vaccines, because if you can get them at a young age, they're screwed. I got vaccines when I was young. Doesn't seem to have harmed me too much. I don't know. Some things you don't even know. Maybe they did harm me, and it'll come back to haunt me. Who knows? But good thing is I'm not going to get any more, and hopefully someday my mother will stop giving those yearly flu shots at her business, because when one of those employees said that she got sick after it, I was thinking, I told you so. But with that being said, next week I'm scheduled to have Barbara Lamb on, extraterrestrial contactee and researcher. She was seen at the In 5D Los Angeles City of Angels Cosmic Awakening Conference, which I was at recently, and hosted by Greg Prescott and Helene Libson. Barbara Lamb was one of the speakers there. Very fascinating interview. Learned a lot of stuff about different types of extraterrestrials. So if you're really into extraterrestrial stuff, be they malevolent or benevolent extraterrestrials and their contact with humans, and also crop circles too, and some psychic powers as well, then next week's show with Barbara Lamb will be for you. With that said, namaste, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your experience without consciousness.